Hello everybody and welcome to All About Film. This video discusses Shanghai Jiancheng Technology Company Limited, we're going to call them SJCT, Shanghai GP3 100 ISO film, looks at how to use it, the film's characteristics, technical details, and sample images. GP3 is a medium-speed film available in almost every format from 35mm up through many obscure roll and ultra-large format sheet films. All the standard formats are also readily available in GP3 with the notable exception of 110. So a couple of interesting things here about GP3, and by the way, when I refer to GP3 in this video, it's only for the 100 ISO film. At some point in the very distant future, the 400 ISO will get its own video, but not today. So, up front, GP3, the factory-made 35mm rolls are reclaimed rolls from other film types with the GP3 label taped or glued to the outside, and the GP3 film itself taped with double-sided tape onto the old film's last, half inch of available material that sticks outside of the cassette. So it appears that rather than buy new cassettes, SJCT is reusing old cassettes, and I think that's awesome. Every manufacturer should be doing that, and they should all be working to get reuse and programs in place with film labs. Another interesting point is that GP3 in 220 has not loaded correctly for me a single time, though I can't yet categorically say if that's due to the backing paper being the wrong length, or if the film back that I have that I've used it in having an issue. Related to that, the 120 film lengths are a hair shorter than those from other makers. On that final point about 120 film, producing lots of film, if you shorten it just a little bit, so that most of the time it doesn't affect the images or cut anything off, that can save a lot of money in the production run. However, it also means that if the 120 roll isn't loaded and aligned perfectly, that the first or last frame is liable to be cut off. That happened to me a number of times, and I couldn't figure out what was going on until I had some GP3 next to some Kodak and Ilford drying at the same time and noticed that the GP3 was just not as long. Here's the best tip that I have for you. Handle this film in terms of the subjects you photograph as though it were a hybrid between orthochromatic and panchromatic film. I have no technical data for this film, but as we'll discuss in the spectral sensitivity section, this film clearly has very reduced red sensitivity, which is going to contribute a lot to explaining many of the aspects of this film that we'll discuss in the image characteristics section. GP3 works best when pulled. I've read that it can be pushed to 1600, but I had problems with this film starting at around 200 ISO and didn't go any further. I found that it worked best at 50 ISO, well at 100, and okay at 25. A Photrio link in the video's description has some technical tests performed by IC Racer, who found GP3 had an actual ISO of 53, so he and I are on the same page in terms of where this film works the best. For my preferred format, I liked GP3 in 120 and larger. I have had good results in 35mm, but for some reason that format is a little bit more unpredictable. Now that the manufacturing process has, it seems, eliminated the issue from around 2014 to 2016 that GP3 had of backing paper texture and numbers imprinting into the film's emulsion, and that's an issue likely due to poor lacquering on the paper. I have an old video I made about this, and I'll link that in the video description if you want to learn more. The 120 images that GP3 in the current batch from the new owners, SJCT, deliver has been absolutely excellent. As a sheet film, GP3 is an affordable and good film for both for people who are starting out in sheet film and for those who are comfortable with the format, because it does offer a unique look and is still a little bit of a challenge to use. My best tip for you to get the most out of this film is to shoot it in either roll film or sheet film format and skip the 35mm. I'd also suggest pulling it a stop and developing it as normal, so shoot it at 50, develop it using 100 ISO times, and that will help you obtain a little bit more negative density and from that a little bit more tonal range. Shooting at 100 and developing it with the 100 ISO times will often clip your shadow detail. And honestly, even shooting it at 50 and developing it at 100, you're still going to lose a lot in the shadows with GP3. As for subjects that work well with GP3, it is a good all-around film and can handle almost any subject pretty well. In sheet film formats where grain is really a non-issue with this film, that is even more true. And I would go so far as to say that even though, yes, I would recommend using it in roll film and larger instead of cassette film, this film really truly shines in sheet film due to the image characteristics. As a general rundown of what this film is like and the image quality, if you use GP3 poorly, then it will give you poor results. And I know that is true of every film, but that's even more true of this film because it has a narrower, suitable range than a lot of black and white films, especially black and white 100 ISO films. GP3 isn't an inexpensive film, but it does have a reputation as being a cheap film. And I think that stems a lot from what the film used to be like back in the mid-2010s, and the stock that is on the market today performs much differently than that old stock. So a lot of people are drawn to GP3 expecting it to save them money, right? Well, here's the best way I can think of to describe GP3. Imagine that you meet a slide film walking down the street and you punch it in the eye and then ask it nicely to take good photos for you. Yeah, that's GP3, and it's going to behave like that slide film that you just punched. You need to handle GP3 from start to finish well and gently and give it a little bit more to maybe a lot more light than you really think that it needs. It is tolerant to overexposure. For grain, this is a hard thing to evaluate from a user perspective in a film stock with as many formats as GP3 offers. In previous videos with this same format challenge, I've noticed that grain is highly format dependent, and I'm going to hide behind that statement again. Starting large in the sheet formats, grain is not visible, or at worst, minor and a pleasing aspect of image character. In the 120 and 220 formats, grain is present and visible, though not intrusive, and it gives images a pleasing and tactile quality. By 35mm, grain becomes a palpable image element, and you will either need to work with it or hate your results. This is not grain that feels like low-grit sandpaper on your eyes, like some films will do, but it's there and noticeable in areas with even tonality like skies. Tonality and tonal range are highly exposure, ISO, and developer dependent. If you shoot GP3 at 100 ISO and develop it normally, you will lose most if not all of your shadow detail and your highlights will be kind of flat. If you pull it a stop to 50 ISO and develop it normally using the times for 100 ISO, you will have a bit more shadow detail that you can recover, and that will come at the expense of minimal highlight shadow interface area loss. This stems from the negative's density when developed at the rated ISO, or specifically the lack of negative density. I found that GP3 often delivered thin negatives compared to other film stocks, and this is evidenced by the many photos in this video where I didn't go to the trouble of cleaning spots, chemical residue, or scratches, things that with thicker negatives aren't visible. When shot at 100 ISO and developed as instructed, thin negatives tend to result in poor tonal range with no shadow detail, so when in doubt, give this film more light than you think it needs. Acutance is a hair mushy. Were I to rank all 100 ISO black and white films, I would expect GP3 to land in the 20th to 30th percentile in terms of acutance sharpness. Now that said, that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just means that your tonal transitions between grains are more gradual than other films. That can be very pleasing for portraits, landscapes, and architectural work. For some subjects, it will translate into sort of a mushy, low contrasty look, but again, with the right subject, that's just fine. High acutance, and by extension low acutance, are not intrinsically qualities or flaws within a film. just a character that needs to be worked with, and that, in the right setting, either high or low acutance can yield really good results that you want. Contrast is entirely dependent on lighting. In overcast settings, contrast suffers and images look like they've been hosed down with mud. I never expected to say this about a film, but it honestly works best with higher contrast lighting, especially in 35mm. You will lose shadow details, but you know what? With GP3, you're losing shadow details anyway, so put it in lighting where it's going to do better work for you. You can work around some of the low contrast issues in overcast settings with filtration, starting with, for instance, a yellow filter on the front of your lens, or using a filter when you go to print to paper in the darkroom. And you can also adjust some of that lack of contrast by pulling the film and then using normal development times, and that will allow you in post to recover some additional shadow detail. Sharpness, curiously, varied by format. I found that the 35mm images had a greater apparent sharpness than did the 120 and 220 format images. Sheet film was generally closer in sharpness to 35mm, though there is likely some benefit there in terms of enlargement factors. The dynamic range, also called gamma, is truncated like an elephant with no nose. Unless GP3 receives a lot of light, shadows hide like a cheap client when the bar tab arrives. You'll notice in this video that many of the landscapes have great cloud detail with poor foreground detail. This illustrates the point above perfectly. Where the camera metered off of the foreground, with film exposed at 100 ISO and developed normally, the metered areas were underexposed. The skies, which saturated the film with light by comparison, are properly exposed. You can improve dynamic range by exposing for your scenes shadows, and then trusting that the film will provide slightly thick but recoverable mid and highlight tones. Digital conversion with GP3 is great. This film retains a lot, if not all, of its character in digital conversion. Now that said, if your negative is poor when you fix it, the digital image will be hard to recover. Some of the other films in this series, like Kentmere 400 and Delta 100, produce negatives that can be recovered almost regardless of their condition and still produce interesting images. That is far less the case with GP3. You do need a good digital conversion workflow, and it needs to be backed by negatives with slight density or proper exposure, a little bit more really than in terms of density than most other 100 ISO black and white films need. Some additional notes here. A major point about GP3, and I can't hammer this home enough, the older stock from 2016 and the years before was not good film. The quality control and production consistency were lacking in every format. The images in this video that show number and paper texture imprints were from that era exclusively. None of the 120 film that's been in this re-released production has had any issues for me. Some of the 4x5 images from that older film in 2015-2016 showed inconsistent negative density. Again, a huge quality control issue. The current GP3 sheet film has not shown any issues with negative density or inconsistent development in my experience. So the current GP3 crop is substantially improved with far more consistent results and substantially better overall image quality in all of the categories that we just discussed versus the 2014 to 2016 batches. So if anyone tells you that GP3 is no good because of what it used to be 7 years ago, as of this video's recording, you can just toss that away because it's a much different film today than it used to be. So I reached out to SJCT to see if they would send me a datasheet, and I got, drumroll please, nothing. But the SJCT website had a fascinating footnote on their GP3 store. It says, GP3 can be handled safely in deep red safe light, which I did once or twice before reading that note out of some moderate tray developing frustration. So I can confirm that with a deep enough red safe light placed far enough away from the film that yes, this film can survive at least brief exposure to that light. What does this tell us? It means that GP3 does not have much red sensitivity and that your warm tone filters will have a much higher than typical filter factor. And as I've said I think once in this video, and we'll say once or twice more later, treat this film as something that's kind of halfway between an orthochromatic and panchromatic film. Really do shoot this film as though it's orthochromatic, and you will get more out of your images than if you try to shoot it like a standard black and white 100 ISO film. Well, speaking of filters and filter factors, yours truly completely blotched the filter test roll that I shot with GP3, so I don't have sample shots of that to share. However, the handful of images that turned out from that roll confirmed that this film has higher than expected filter factors for warm tone filters and generally as expected filter factors for cool tone filters. For your red filters, a starting point might be double the recommended filter factor or more. Your mileage will vary based on filter brand, color tinting agent, and your own lighting, so dedicating a roll to testing filters and recording your results would be a good idea. With warm tone filters and this film, you will not be able to trust the TTL meter on your camera because it sees color spectra that this film cannot. And if you use a red filter with your TTL meter, it will not effectively compensate to deliver enough light to this film. This table is meant only as a starting point. If you want to see the original table, check the Reddit link in the video description for a post by Reddit user Kai Wang. I've modified the original table's data to make it easier to remember and to align with my experience, but the data on the table that I've created here are well within the GP3 tolerance range. The source table and post have no indication as to from whom the author obtained the data, just a note from the author indicating that it came from someone kind enough to share a fuzzy screenshot. So take these data for what they are, a reasonable starting point for your own experimentation, and understand that I adulterated the original data to make memorizing the pattern easier, but that what I have here should be pretty darn close to what you need for reciprocity failure. I did not reproduce the entire table. I reproduced key data from that table to give you a starting point to build off of. As a rough guide, in addition to increasing the exposure time by the exposure multiplier, you need to reduce the developing time. To arrive at the percentage of developing time reduction, you need to multiply the exposure multiplier by 4 and reduce the development time by that percentage. For me, that makes the reciprocity data here a little bit easier to remember, and it gets you to within the film development's latitude. So basically, you're going to take the metered exposure time, multiply that by the exposure multiplier to have the exposure time. That exposure multiplier, you then multiply by 4, and that's your development reduction. So basically, the most important data point here is going to be your exposure multiplier. The slight change that I made into the table's data will translate into some seconds of overdevelopment compared with the source data, but as I've said, this film does benefit from more light and a little bit of overdevelopment, so your film will be fine. All of the times in this table are provided in seconds, and by the way, this really only applies if you're shooting sheet film or an entire roll or cassette with long exposures. You can't develop just one frame off of your 120 or 35 millimeter film with less developing time and have the rest of the film turn out well. So this table's really only meant for people who are using sheet film or shooting an entire roll of film with long exposures, with the same long exposure. The SJCT provided developing info gives a baseline for box speed development with a number of different developers. That's available, by the way, in at least every package that I've gotten of this film, especially for the sheet film. The massive development chart has data with developing times from 64 to 400 ISO. I primarily shot this at 50 ISO and developed it using the 100 ISO times. Seeing early on how GP3 performed when shot and developed for 100 ISO versus being shot at 50 and developed for 100, I held little hope that GP3 would push well and didn't really try too much. That said, I did shoot it at both 25 and 200 ISO and developed it in Rodinal 1+25 as a comparison. Looking past the backing paper damage on these samples, it's clear that 25 ISO film has better tonal range and shadow detail than the 200 ISO example, the latter of which has almost become tone separation stock. And my strong recommendation here is going to be to keep it in the 32 to 64 ISO range and to develop it with the 100 ISO times provided by SJCT. My experience indicates that is a good place to start to see how this film performs for you. Over the years, I put GP3 through at least 23 sensitivity chemistry and dilution combinations. In general, GP3 handled most of the developers I threw at it in good form. Most developers yielded results that I really could not tell apart from one another. And that's rare, and I think it speaks highly of how consistently GP3 develops in different chemistries. So, in most chemistries, you can develop the new GP3 stocks and expect fairly consistent results. That said, I did pick 3 favorites. Xtol 1+1 was the best in terms of mid-range tonality and image quality. It did clip the shadows a bit, but that's honestly hard to avoid with this stock. And also, the gamma appeared a bit flatter than most comparable films when developed in Xtol 1+1. HC110, which is Legacy Pro 110 in my case, at a concentration of 1+15, was a pretty darn close second with similar performance to the Xtol 1+1. Honestly, I could have flipped a coin on which of these I liked the best and been happy with the outcome either way. So if you're looking for one of these 2 different chemistries to use, go with the less expensive option. A clear third place for me, but a developer that imparted a fantastic overall image quality into GP3 was Legacy Pro MicX at 1+2. MicX helped reduce grain and gave the images a good deal of shadow detail. I ranked it third instead of first or second because the negatives were a bit flat, and some of the tonal range was hard to recover in post, surprisingly. Also, the MicX 1+2 results were less consistent across formats than were those of Xtol 1+1 and HC 1+15. Picking 3 developers to hate was pretty easy, and I think these results are surprising. Worst of the lot, Xtol 1+3 returned thin, muddy negatives with uneven development. Oddly, other films developed in this same tank, other film stocks, not other GP3s, did not exhibit the same issue that GP3 did in this concentration. A very close second worst, Rodinal 1+50, left the results underdeveloped with poor shadow detail and overall muddy results. In a distant third, and honestly, I could have left this off because the results were unpredictable but not uniformly terrible, was Xtol 1+2. This did, much to my surprise, perform far differently than 1.1. I'm honestly always fascinated by how small chemical change can have such drastic differences. I have also an honorable mention in this category, and that's Rodinal 1+100 for stand developing. This was a highly inconsistent chemistry. When the results were good, they were really great, and they could have been discussed in the previous section about great developers. But sometimes, and for reasons I don't understand, this combination just turned out thin negatives or images with very mushy contrast and poor detail. And that would occur on the same night with water from the same batch of filtered pitcher water and with fresh chemistry mixed up for each of the stand developing baths. So, very frustrating. One consistent thing with all of these really poor performing developers is that all of the negatives appeared to be very thin. So it is a distinct possibility that these developers could all return very good results with longer developing times. So take that for what you will, and if these are ones you really, really want to try using, it might be worth doing some test developments with longer developing times to see how the results fare. GP3 is like an old radio signal bouncing around the atmosphere looking for a receiver. The look and behavior feel out of place here in the 21st century. GP3 performs like a vintage film inspired by glass plate technology, and it delivers images that would have been cutting edge in the late 1950s. And for me, that gives it a unique place in the market with the potential to deliver captivating images. But if we're honest, GP3 is far from the ideal film for everyone. GP3's history goes back to 1958 in some way, shape, or form. Most film photographers now know it as a cheap stock that used to arrive in taped up bricks that looked like decoys dropped out of planes flying north from Colombia, and then the individual rolls being wrapped in wrappers so red that Mao Zedong shed a tear every time one was opened. As a sidebar, I do miss the red wrappers because they were distinctive. Anyway, in the mid-2010s, the factory that makes GP3 landed in new hands and the production quality dropped like a microphone when the comedy set was fire. And I used GP3 back then, but primarily as dummy film for testing developers and things like that because it was all universally unusable and also only cost about $1.25 per 120 roll. Then GP3 went away in or around 2016, and I was completely fine with that because I hated this stuff. And I was disappointed only because I was very close to done with this video, and it was originally slated to be the third video in this series, not the 32nd, 33rd, however many of these I've done. A lot. But had I made this video in 2016, it would have been far different, and honestly, it would have been resoundingly and universally negative as well. So I'm glad that I decided to redo it now and primarily use new images, only using old images where I absolutely had to. So let's fast forward to around 2023 and GP3 comes back. I was highly skeptical of the new product and the sample photos I saw online. Honestly, I didn't think the sample photos were really taken on GP3 because they looked too good. So I bought a handful of rolls of 120 from a few different vendors, hoping they would be from different lots. They were. And I tested my first rolls and recorded the lot information that's on the boxes for each roll on the first frame of each roll that I used, so that I could see if the different lots had different problems. I fully expected the backing paper to imprint onto the new film again, as well as other issues with exposure and development to manifest. But none of these issues did, and the images in these perfunctory test rolls showed a bit of promise. So I got some more, and some sheet film in 4x5 and 8x10 and 100 feet or 200 feet, something like that, of 35mm, plus a handful of the factory rolls in that size. I had shot the old GP3 in 35mm 120 and 4x5, and back then even the sheet film was terrible with inconsistent negative density and poor contrast. But GP3 in sheet film now is good, if you can and will work with the image aesthetic that it provides. If you want a sheet film that delivers images with an orthochromatic look, something akin to a glass plate but easier and cheaper to use, then GP3 could work for you. In the right hands, with the right subject in front of the camera, GP3 can work very well. So that gets us to the crux of this video. Who is GP3 for? If you shoot 35mm, likely not you. It's far from the cheapest option, and some of the lower priced films, like Kentmere, perform better and are easier to use. If you shoot 120, well, again, not you, as GP3 is almost as expensive as Acros II, at least here in the US, and it is, at best, on par with options that cost half as much. If you shoot sheet film or obscure roll films, then very possibly GP3 is your film. SJCT deserves a lot of credit for figuring out how to reintroduce old film formats, 127, 220, and 620 specifically, and make that a niche market for themselves. They are also one of 3 companies, Ilford and Adox being the others, making sheet film in many obscure sizes. Really, all that's missing is 110, and honestly, I won't lie, this film would be a gas to use in 110. GP3 has gotten a lot better in this iteration of the film. It's a film I now like. It's not the easiest film to use, nor at all is it the most forgiving black and white film. In fact, as I've said, it behaves a lot like a persnickety slide film. GP3, it's like an inconsistent baseball player. It won't always connect, but when it does, someone in the stands is getting a concussion.